Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Raewyn Densley. And Raewyn, as most of you in this room will know, is an agribusiness consultant for AgFirst and Pioneer. She's a dairy nutrition and forage specialist, and she's been around the block for a couple of good decades. And of course, she's got lots of experience working in dairy, sheep and beef, dairy, goat and arable sectors. And so today she's going to be talking about, is the current New Zealand dairy production model sustainable? Thank you, Raewyn.
Thanks, Alison, and can you keep me on track and give me some time warnings, because I'm like my husband, I talk too much. And hopefully I can work this all right. The green button? Perfect. So today I really want to just look at, is the current New Zealand dairy production model sustainable? And pull in some recent work we've done within AgFirst that kind of looked at future systems, and in particular a big project we've just completed on how New Zealand could reduce its reliance on internationally produced feed. So really 3 questions to cover off today. The first one is, where has dairying come from and where is it heading? Really looking at the sustainability goals for future farms, and I think a lot of that's been covered off very well in Margaret's presentation, but also answering the question, can cropping have a role in future farm systems? If we look at dairy farming in New Zealand, roughly over the last 30 years, and that kind of spans the period of time that David and I have both been involved in both the maize and the dairy industry in New Zealand, we've seen some massive changes. So if we look at cows, we've seen an increase in 2.6 million cows over those 3 decades. We're producing another 132 kilos of milk solids per cow. And we've actually seen, and this number really staggered me when I had a look at it, we've seen 730,000 hectares of land converted into dairying. And the interesting thing with this is that quite a lot of it is land that either was, in the case of Canterbury, arable land, or in other places land which could have been used for cropping, because in general arable cropping and dairying are competing for the same land. So now the consequence of that is that we've seen a massive increase in feed demand on farm, and we've seen the feed demand move from about 9.3 up to 23.6 million tonnes of dry matter eaten. So a large increase in the feed, driven really by more cows, more hectares and more production per cow. What's happened over time, and we've really seen this change happen in a big way, is we've gone from a very much pasture-based dairy farm system to one which is still pasture-based, but is also quite reliant on other feeds. In fact, at the moment, 15 to 20% of what New Zealand dairy cows eat is not pasture. And we've seen from 2000, but particularly from the sort of 07-08 drought, which was here, the rise in the use of palm kernel. We've seen the increase in maize silage. We've seen things like fodder beet come in here, but overall you can see there's been quite a rise in the amount of feed that's been purchased in. If you actually have a look at those changes over time, the compound annual growth rates for supplements, harvested supplements like maize, about 5.6% growth year on year, grown supplements like beet and kale, the same, 5.6%, but imported feeds like, in particular palm kernel, have increased 9% year on year, really over the last 3 decades. And the dairying demand for imported feed has increased, but really the growth of dairying has decreased the amount of land that's able to grow crops and grains. And this is really what's driven the importation of feed. Dairying has required more feed, but taken up the land that historically would have been used to grow it. And consequently, we've seen this rise in the dairy demand for internationally produced feed. This is a USDA graph that shows just over the last few years what our grain and feed imports would be. And about 11% of the national herd is actually supported by internationally produced feed. 11%. So it's actually quite a high number. We think that we're a pastoral dairy system and we're relatively self-contained, but 11% of the feed that's used to feed our cows is actually produced internationally. And if we have a look here at the bottom in this beigey colour, this is palm kernel. We've seen also grains kind of increase over time. A lot of that isn't going into the dairy industry, but we've seen grains increase. And just really total feed inputs have become quite stable, and New Zealand is a net importer of feed. So what will shape future dairy systems? And I think Professor Hamish Gow, Lincoln University, he started at Massey, which was a good thing. He says we're moving to a world where products are actually governed not by regulations that are set by the government, but really by the consumer. And this is in line with what Nestle is saying. And I think down the track, it really won't matter what the government or the regional council are wanting in terms of driving our systems. It will be what the consumer, the global consumer, is actually requiring from us. It's actually quite off-putting up here with the lights in your eyes. It's kind of, you feel like you're a possum in the headlights. So if we look at the sustainability considerations, greenhouse gas emissions is obviously really at the forefront. And I think the thing that you have to remember with greenhouse gas is that it's a global problem. With nitrogen leaching in soil and those kind of things, while they're important on a global perspective, what we do here doesn't have quite the same bearing as it does with greenhouse gas. We all share the same air, we all share the same planet, and greenhouse gas is really a global issue. And so consumers want milk produced with a low greenhouse gas footprint. And the government is interested in losses at a farmer level, according to the Paris Accord. And so the government is actually interested in the agricultural losses, and agriculture is almost about half of New Zealand's total greenhouse gas losses. And agriculture, and that's a high percentage. New Zealand has really got the highest percent of losses attributed to agriculture of any nation. So the government's interested in that. That's the Paris Accord. But actually the consumer is actually interested at Scope 3 emissions. This is kind of more like a whole system, a cradle to grave approach. And you can see, and this comes out of Fonterra's net zero booklet that they've sent out to their suppliers, that palm kernel has got very, very high losses relative to grain-based supplements or to pasture. And the reason for that is that we've actually seen big losses associated with afforestation. This big other is actually the methane. A lot of it is the methane that comes from palm oil manufacturing extract ponds. Those things put out a huge, large amount of methane. So we can see that supplements like palm kernel have got way higher losses than pasture silage or maize silage, much, much higher. And so while at the moment New Zealand farmers are just trying to get their head around what is my obligation from a government standpoint and what will I need to do, the reality is that the world has kind of moved on. They're not just interested in on-farm losses, they're interested in the embedded losses that are associated with farm inputs. And I think that is both an important, but actually from a crop perspective and from a local arable industry, that's actually quite an exciting thing, because we're actually dealing in the main with products that are kind of sitting down around here in terms of their greenhouse gas losses, and our main competitor in the dairy industry is palm kernel, which has a really huge embedded loss associated with it. If we look at sustainability, I think food security is going to be really important. consumers want animals to be well fed, and there's a whole tranche really of regulations that are coming in that are really focused on animal welfare, and that includes feed management, how we house our cows. It's stuff like pugging and standing animals in mud. All of those regulations are starting to come through, but consumers want animals to be well fed. And the impacts of climate change will include greater variability in rainfall, more moisture and heat stress days, and we will actually see greater variation in pasture yields as a consequence. And there will also be a trend toward more C4 grasses, and that's things like kikuyu and paspalum, which tend to be less nutritious. It's really interesting in the Waikato here. Tim Sandbrook from Open Country has been for several years surveying the quality of pasture on New Zealand dairy farms. At the moment, just right now, it's as bad as it's been in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of quality. And you might say, why is that? It's kind of green and growing. I think we're starting to see the influx from several warm summers of summer grasses into our ryegrass clover pastures, and I think already we are starting to see that summer nutritive change from moving toward less productive and less nutritious species. And so we're starting at the moment. I think the average ME his survey across the Waikato was 10.3. We would normally only expect to see that kind of levels when it's starting to get dry and stalky, but I think we're seeing the trend already. If we look at sustainability considerations, palm kernel is actually largely produced in Indonesia and Malaysia. There's a little bit that comes out of some of the other countries, but mainly it's in Indonesia and Malaysian produced. And it's actually, look who's the biggest global importer of palm kernel extract. It's us here, it's little old New Zealand. And there are a number of sustainability concerns surrounding palm kernel. There are human rights and workforce kind of issues, and also just on a global basis there is a Western consumer trend away from palm oil, and there's a lot of global research going into things like yeast oils, some really big names that are backing research into alternatives to palm oil. And there's a range of reasons why people don't want palm oil, but from a dairy perspective, it actually produces dairy products that have higher atherogenic or heart disease kind of factors within the dairy products, and that's been documented by the Irish. And so I think globally we're starting to see a little bit of a trend away from palm oil in things, and we're also, I believe, going to see a trend away from consumers wanting dairy products made from cows that have been fed palm kernel products. That aside, there are also the processing issues that are associated with feeding too much palm, and we've already seen Fonterra bring in, some limits, the FEI limits. They gave those a little bit of a break over the spring, but they're back in place. So if we move on and we look at sustainability, we also are interested in water quality. And again, consumers want farmers to protect the environment in which they farm. And nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment and E. coli targets are all being set at a catchment level, and these will become increasingly important. And more cows per hectare really is higher losses in terms of all of these factors. And so if we have a look at where does the future lie, I think there's just some really important points. New Zealand has reached peak cow numbers, and there's several reasons for this. Part of it is this environmental stuff that's coming in, but also the highly productive land legislation that has come in place. It means that it's basic, and the ranking of systems, you really can't convert land to dairy anymore. But we're seeing dairy land being eroded by urban sprawl, by horticulture, and so we're seeing farms go out of dairying, but no more can come in. So we've really reached peak cow, and the focus moving forward is going to need to be on on production per cow. And systems that produce more milk per cow tend to be more efficient in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. They have less replacements, and and that lower replacement also helps to drive down the requirement for feed and the greenhouse gas emissions. Imported feeds like palm kernel have got these higher embedded losses, and they potentially will become more difficult to procure over time, particularly if we see a decrease in the demand for palm oil. Climate change will make pasture growth more variable, and I think farmers will need to consider water efficiency in the species that they grow, and also they will need to carry a feed buffer. And this has been something that New Zealand farm systems have been really quite poor at, is carrying a feed buffer. And globally, if we set aside the kind of the third world where they can't afford to, but if we look at North American, for example, European systems, you would not see somebody that was kind of going hand to mouth in terms of feed. They've always got a buffer in place, and we are going to, as we see the variability in climate, we are going to need to head toward those systems. There's going to be a move away from bobby calves. They did a big survey in the US, and they looked at what were the things that consumers were most concerned about. The number one thing, when farmers learnt about dairy practices, the one thing that they were most concerned about was the fact that baby calves were separated from their mothers. That was a major concern for them. And so I think we're going to see a move away from bobby calves, and that will increase the demand for grain. And while buying in locally produced crops will be a preferred option for some people, others will actually look at buying crops in off farm. Our land and water survey, which we did, project that we did, looked at on-farm cropping. And so what we did, it was whole systems model using FarmX and Overseer. We looked at a number of regions, and all of those farms used a mix of imported and homegrown feeds. What we did was we said, what happens, we took it to either extreme. What happens if it grows all its feed? What happens if it buys in all of its feed? So we looked at two extremes. And then we modelled those things through FarmX and Overseer. What we saw was if farms grew all of their crops on farm, they actually had to reduce stocking rates slightly to do so. They reduced milk production, but in most cases, they actually didn't reduce profitability, with the exception probably being in the lower part of the South Island. And so we actually saw that the nitrogen leaching numbers remained relatively similar. In these situations, the farms didn't have feed pads, and if we saw a feed pad in the system, we would expect a different outcome, but we just modelled the infrastructure that the typical farm had. And so we saw a kind of similar nitrogen leaching, but the big gain was in greenhouse gas. We actually took a hectare of cows is somewhere around 10 tonne of carbon. A hectare of crop is somewhere around 2 to 3 tonne of carbon per hectare. And so by decreasing stocking rate and actually growing crops on farm, we saw 6 to 13% less greenhouse gas emissions, and all of the farm systems and all of the regions showed a decrease. In the full report, and if anybody's interested in it, come up and see me afterwards, and I'll give you a card. You can email me and I can send you the full report, but we did some sensitivity, and as the milk prices were lower and the concentrate was higher, it made more sense to actually grow your own crops than it did to buy in feed, and particularly we were looking at this internationally produced feed. So, just really my conclusions, the current dairy model needs to change to meet new sustainability goals. The important thing is that those are going to really be driven by the consumer. We need, climate change means farmers will continue to need more than just pasture for their systems. And finally, dropping stocking rate and cropping on farm is actually a reliable way to decrease greenhouse gas losses, and in many cases the impact on profitability is actually quite minimal. Thank you.
So we've got time just for for a few questions for Raewyn.
Raewyn, growing maize on a dairy platform, did they associate all the costs to that, compare it to buying it in?
So both the on-farm and the growing in both had maize in the model, but the buying in scenario where all the crops were bought in also had other higher cost feeds as well. So yeah, it did attribute all of the costs, but I think the thing is you need to remember that was kind of an average model, and I think a lot of people are actually going to move toward a system of both, where they're buying some in and growing some, because particularly with guys that are running higher stocking rates to start with, it becomes difficult to keep at that stocking rate level and grow all your own feed. So yeah, it did include the full costs, but as I say, you know, both of the scenarios had, in the North Island at least, had maize in them, because maize is really, you know, the highest yielding crop. All of the research is showing that, but I think that the difference was partially driven by the other things that were in that buy-in model, and one of those was palm kernel. Yeah.